I sighed, letting the blue sun energy dissipate from my hand like smoke in the wind. The whole experiment had been a bust, leaving me with more questions than answers. While the red and blue sun energies had been absolutely instrumental in my victory against Guacini in the realm of living lyrics, hell, I probably would have lost without them. They seemed to have almost no effect in this world. At least, no effect that I could immediately observe. Actually, that wasn't entirely accurate. Channeling the blue sun energy did seem to boost my vessel's cultivation. The difference was pretty significant, actually. Du Yanzi's cultivation had increased to the middle stage of the crowned heart realm. But the source of that boost felt more external rather than internal, like I was borrowing power rather than actually advancing, similar to what one could expect from gaining a sudden increase in the number of witnesses of fate. Which was completely absurd considering I was sitting alone in the middle of an abandoned shrine with nothing but a nervous servant and some withered trees for company. Not having had much success with either sun, I decided to turn my focus on the energy I was most familiar with, qi. I channeled a small amount into my right hand, just enough to create a faint glow around my palm. The surrounding Xian Yi, which had been flowing through the air in lazy, self-satisfied currents, suddenly paused. For a moment, everything went completely still, like the entire world was holding its breath. Then they rushed toward my hand like a pack of starving wolves. I watched in fascination as the Xian Yi began attacking the qi with what could only be described as suicidal determination. These energy currents were literally throwing themselves at the small amount of qi I'd manifested, and they were being destroyed in the process. But like any protagonist who was thick-headed enough to fight against overwhelming odds, the Xian Yi just kept coming. Each strand seemed convinced that it would be the one to overcome the superior energy through sheer force of will. I wasn't sure exactly how much Xian Yi was being consumed, but it was an absurd amount. Wave after wave of the energy threw itself against my qi, and wave after wave was annihilated. The whole process probably lasted less than a minute, but by the time it was over, the qi in my hand had been completely devoured. The trade-off was remarkably inefficient from the Xian Yi's perspective. It had taken hundreds of times more local energy to consume that single strand of qi. This didn't surprise me. After all, qi was a higher form of energy compared to Xian Yi, just like how qi was superior to harmonic essence in the realm of living lyrics. What did surprise me was the Xian Yi's willingness to actually attack qi in the first place. But then again, it did make sense given how diluted everything in this realm seemed to be. What really caught my attention was what happened next. The surviving Xian Yi that had managed to consume some of the qi began to calm down. Not only did it seem more powerful, but it was like it was becoming less insane and more normal. The chaotic, self-aggrandizing quality that seemed to define Xian Yi was fading, replaced by something that felt more balanced. The tale has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Azure, are you seeing this? I asked internally. Yes, Master. The qi appears to be having a purifying effect on the local energy, similar to how it commands other lower forms, but in this case it's actually changing their fundamental nature. Before I could figure out the full implications of what I was seeing, I detected movement in my peripheral vision. A massive tree, easily over 100 feet tall, turned its attention toward me with the slow, deliberate movement of something ancient and powerful. My eyes widened as I felt the spiritual pressure radiating from it. The aura coming from this tree was definitely at the crowned heart realm. For a moment we stared at each other. Well, I stared at it. I wasn't entirely sure how trees stared back, but I could feel its attention focused on me with laser-like intensity. Then it started moving. One of its thicker branches, sharp as a spear and harder than steel, came down towards me. Li Chong had been having a wonderful day so far. Ever since the divine being had chosen his young master as a vessel, he had been practically vibrating with excitement. After years of watching Du Yanzi struggle with repeated failures and humiliations, seeing him selected by a higher power felt like vindication of everything Li Chong had always believed about the Du family's destined greatness. The young master was truly chosen by heaven itself. All those defeats at the hands of Lu Wenjun, all the mockery from lesser cultivators who couldn't recognize true potential when they saw it, All of it had just been trials to prepare Du Yanzi for this moment. But as he watched the divine being conduct various experiments from his position near the shrine's entrance, Li Chang began to feel a growing sense of unease. He wasn't sure what kind of tests the higher being was performing, but the energies being used made his skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with their obvious power. There was something about the red energy that made every instinct Li Chang possessed scream warnings. It felt hungry, predatory, like it wanted to devour everything it touched. Even from a distance, he could sense its aggressive nature pressing against his consciousness. The blue energy was different, but somehow even more unsettling. Where the red felt like a wild beast that might attack anything, the blue felt calculating, patient, like a spider waiting in its web. It didn't seem immediately threatening, but Li Chang had the uncomfortable feeling that it was studying him, cataloging his weaknesses for future reference. Neither energy felt particularly divine, at least not in any way that Li Chang associated with benevolent higher powers. Still, he reminded himself, divine beings operated on scales that mortals couldn't comprehend. What seemed strange or unsettling to him might be perfectly normal for entities that existed beyond the normal laws of reality. Who was he, a mere servant, to question the methods of someone chosen by heaven itself? But as the minutes passed, Li Chang's worry finally overcame his reluctance to interfere. He needed to check on Du Yanzi, even if it meant approaching a divine being conducting mysterious experiments. Moving carefully through the underbrush, Li Chang crept closer to the abandoned shrine. Through the gaps in the trees, he could see his master sitting peacefully on the boulder, apparently unharmed. Li Chang allowed himself to relax slightly. Perhaps his worries were unfounded. Perhaps a massive tree suddenly launched itself at his master. Li Chang's blood turned to ice as he watched the ancient oak, which had been standing peacefully near the shrine for as long as he could remember, suddenly animate and attack. The tree's massive branch came down like a spear, aimed directly at young Master Du Yanzi's head. Li Chang ran, crashing through the underbrush without regard for stealth or dignity. His aging legs pumped with desperate energy as he tried to reach his master in time. But he was too far away, he would never make it. "Young master!" he cried out, anguish tearing at his voice. Then Li Chang stopped so suddenly that he nearly fell over, his eyes widening in shock. The tree hadn't attacked the young master. Instead, it was prostrating itself. The massive cultivator was literally bowing, its great trunk bent at an impossible angle, its branches touching the ground in a gesture of absolute submission and respect. Li Chang stood there for a long moment, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, slowly, tears began to stream down his face as he realized what had just happened. The heavens really had blessed the Du clan. After 3 generations of decline, after decades of humiliation and exile, their fortunes had finally turned. A divine being had not only chosen Du Yanzi as a vessel, but that divine being was so powerful that even ancient tree spirits prostrated themselves in recognition of his authority. Li Chang fell to his knees, overwhelmed by gratitude and vindication. Every year of loyal service, every moment of unwavering faith in his young master's eventual triumph, had been worth it for this single moment of validation. The Du clan would rise again. I'd seen a lot of strange things since entering this realm, but watching a 100-foot-tall tree repeatedly slam its massive trunk against the ground in what could only be described as the world's most violent prostration had to rank somewhere near the top of the list. The sound was incredible. Each impact sent tremors through the earth that I could feel in my bones, and I was genuinely worried the ancient oak might crack its own bark with the enthusiasm of its self-flagellation. "Great and magnificent divine being," the tree boomed. "This lowly servant begs your forgiveness for its countless transgressions." Thud. Another head slam into the dirt. I blinked, looking around the abandoned shrine to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious. Nope, still just me, Li Chang standing slack-jawed by the entrance, and apparently one very apologetic piece of lumber. I said eloquently. "You can stop hitting yourself now. What exactly are you thanking me for?" The tree lifted its massive trunk, leaves rustling with what sounded suspiciously like relief. "Oh, benevolent master, surely you jest. This unworthy one failed to properly greet you upon your divine arrival. Such disrespect, such arrogance, and when your righteous fury nearly stripped away this servant's consciousness entirely." I felt my eyebrows climb toward my hairline. "I did what now?" "The terror, master, the absolute existential dread as your crimson wrath devoured everything this one believed about itself." The tree's branches swayed dramatically. For precious moments, this humble servant forgot its own name, its purpose, even the very concept of what it meant to exist. But then, oh glorious mercy, your azure benevolence restored not just consciousness, but revealed the ultimate truth. Which was, I asked slowly, that this one was created for the singular honor of serving you, divine master. Every ring of growth, every branch and leaf, shaped by destiny itself to provide whatever assistance your magnificence might require. I stared at the tree for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. The only thing I'd done since arriving was sit on that boulder and experiment with red and blue sun energy. Unless the pieces started clicking together. The red sun energy I channeled must have hit this tree, and from what it described, that crimson force had essentially deconstructed its sense of self, stripped away all its delusions of grandeur and reduced it to existential terror. But then the blue sun energy had rebuilt it, not as whatever grandiose identity it had possessed before, but as a devoted follower, a witness of fate as this realm would call it. The reality of what had occurred made my stomach churn. The red sun energy didn't just create doubt. It was like a spiritual acid that dissolved a being's entire sense of identity. And the blue sun energy didn't heal that damage so much as reprogram the victim into devoted servitude. That was genuinely horrifying. "Master," the tree continued, its voice taking on an almost parental pride, "this servant hopes you will not be displeased by a small development." "What kind of development?" I asked suspiciously. Instead of answering directly, the ancient oak rustled its lower branches, and something small and green peeked out from behind its massive trunk. It was a sapling, maybe 2 feet tall, with delicate leaves that shimmered silver green in the afternoon light. The little tree, because it was definitely another tree, looked around with wide, curious eyes before immediately ducking back behind its parent with a soft squeak of alarm. "This one's offspring," the oak explained with unmistakable fondness. "Little Bloom here gained consciousness mere minutes ago, blessed by the overflow of your divine energies. She is quite overwhelmed by the concept of existence, as you might imagine. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident." My heart did something complicated in my chest. From Du Yenz's memories, I knew that even in this realm natural consciousness awakening was incredibly rare. Most beings that developed sentience did so through centuries of cultivation or exposure to powerful spiritual events. For a sapling to spontaneously awaken, "Master," Azure whispered in my mind, "granting consciousness to inanimate objects is typically something only a rank for Lightweaver or a life realm expert could accomplish." He was right. It seemed the blue sun energy was more powerful in this realm than I could have expected. Noticing the little tree peek at me, I decided to lower myself down to her level so I don't appear as scary, and offer what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Hello, little Bloom. How are you feeling?" The sapling stepped out from behind her parent, still nervous but clearly curious. I feel good, great one. Everything is so bright and new. Is it normal to make sounds inside my head?" "Yes, that's perfectly normal," I chuckled despite the situation. "Those are called thoughts, and they're how you understand the world around you." "Thoughts?" Little Bloom repeated, tasting the word. "I like thoughts. They're like tiny flowers blooming in my mind. Do you have thoughts too, great one?" "I do," I said patiently. "Everyone with consciousness has thoughts. They help us decide what to do and understand what we're seeing." Little Bloom's leaves rustled with excitement. "Can I think about anything I want? Can I think about clouds? And birds? And the way sunlight feels on my leaves?" You can think about anything you want, I assured her. That's one of the wonderful things about consciousness. Your thoughts are yours alone. The little tree practically glowed with happiness. Thank you, Great One. Thank you for making me able to think. I want to think about everything. I found myself genuinely smiling at her enthusiasm. There was something pure and innocent about a consciousness that was only minutes old, unmarked by the cynicism and calculation that came with experience. Papa, little Bloom said, turning to the larger tree, can I think about serving the Great One too? I want to help. Of course, my child, the tree replied, its voice filled with parental pride. That is our highest purpose, to serve the Divine One in whatever way he requires. The smile on my face froze. I did not like where this was heading. What do you think you'd like to do? I asked. Master, I will follow you forever and ever, she replied with the innocent determination that only a child could muster. The casual acceptance in her voice made me want to punch something. This innocent being, mere minutes old, had been conditioned for a lifetime of servitude based on an accident of energy overflow. An accident caused by me. Behind her, the ancient oak nodded approvingly. The child shows proper respect, Master. This servant has already begun instructing her in the fundamentals of devotion. Instructing her? That settled it. Whatever the blue sun energy had done to these trees, I wasn't leaving them trapped in this forced loyalty. I had noticed something interesting during my earlier experiments. When Qi encountered Xianyi, the local energy didn't just get consumed. It became more stable, more rational, less insane, which gave me hope that Qi could undo whatever effects the blue sun energy had on the poor little tree's Xianyi. Bloom, I said, extending my hand. Would you like to try something? I want to show you a different kind of energy. She looked to her father, who immediately nodded. If the master wishes to share his power with you, child, it is a tremendous honor. I nearly winced at the programmed response, but I gently placed my palm against the sapling's smooth bark. I channeled a tiny, controlled stream of spiritual energy into her system. This might feel strange, I warned, but I want you to try to absorb this energy. I extended a small tendril of Qi toward little Bloom, carefully restraining its natural dominance to keep it from fighting back against the lower-tier energy. The moment it touched her spiritual foundation, her Xianyi reacted exactly as I'd expected, rushing to attack the foreign energy with vicious determination. It's fighting inside me, Bloom whispered. That's normal, I said gently, watching her spiritual energy tear apart the Qi with desperate fervor. Your energy thinks it's protecting you. Just let it happen. The Xianyi that had devoured the Qi began to evolve, its manic conviction transforming into something calmer, more rational. The evolved energy spread through her consciousness like clear water washing away mud. As it did, the artificial devotion that had been programmed into her by the blue sun energy began to dissolve. The delusions that made her believe service was her highest purpose crumbled away. Bloom's posture subtly shifted. Her branches straightened, and when she looked at me, her eyes held a confusion that hadn't been there before. I feel funny, she said, her voice small and uncertain. Like I was sleeping but now I'm awake? Papa, why did I think I had to? She trailed off, looking between her father and me with growing bewilderment. I don't understand what happened. You're free now, I said gently. Free to think your own thoughts. She blinked slowly, processing this. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a pure, innocent expression that had nothing to do with programmed worship. You helped me, she said simply. Thank you, mister. That was really nice. The sincerity in her voice triggered something in Du Yenz's cultivation base. I felt a small but noticeable surge in spiritual pressure. Not enough to advance a stage, but definitely a meaningful boost. Apparently, gaining a genuine witness of fate, someone who chose to believe in you rather than being compelled to, had even greater benefits. Papa, Bloom said, turning to the ancient oak. Doesn't he seem nice? He made the bad feelings go away. Master. The ancient oak's voice had changed, becoming confused and somewhat alarmed. What has happened to the child? Her spiritual signature feels different. Would you like the same treatment? I offered. Despite knowing that the ancient tree would likely have a completely different reaction to being freed from mind control, likely a negative reaction, I still felt it was the right thing to do. The tree hesitated, clearly torn between programmed loyalty and growing awareness that something significant was happening. If it pleases you, Master. This time I had to use significantly more chi. The oak's consciousness was ancient and more deeply rooted, literally and figuratively. I extended multiple streams of chi toward the tree's vast spiritual network, keeping each tendril passive as they made contact. The tree's Xian-Yi responded with overwhelming force, rushing to defend against what it perceived as an invasion. Centuries of accumulated conviction threw itself at the chi with desperate fury, devouring the foreign energy piece by piece. The moment the Xian-Yi had finished evolving, the change in the tree's behavior was dramatic. What did you do to me? The tree's voice was no longer reverent but filled with a growing, terrible understanding. I can see clearly now. What I felt before, that wasn't loyalty. That was mind control, I said quietly. As expected, the ancient tree's branches began to shake with rage. You violated my mind, made me grovel like a slave, made me teach my own child to worship you. The ancient oak's spiritual pressure flared as centuries of cultivated power focused into pure fury. Branches creaked ominously as the tree prepared to strike, and I tensed, ready to flee. I had no intentions fighting them after the mess I had accidentally created. Papa, no. Little Bloom darted between us, her small form placing itself directly in the path of her father's wrath. He didn't mean to hurt us. He made the bad feelings go away, remember? He helped us. The oak's rage faltered as he looked down at his daughter. Child, you don't understand. I understand Papa was trapped and now Papa isn't, she said with the simple logic of the very young. And I understand the nice Mr. made us feel better. So maybe Papa shouldn't be mad. The tree's branches slowly lowered as he studied his daughter's earnest face. Then he looked at me, really looked, and I saw the exact moment his anger transformed into something else entirely. She's right. You freed us, he said slowly. You could have left us trapped in false devotion, using us for whatever power that worship provided. Instead, you chose to liberate us from slavery. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. I never intended for any of this to happen. I was just experimenting with energies I don't fully understand, and they affected you in ways I didn't foresee. I should have been more careful. The ancient oak was quiet for a long moment. Few beings of power would admit fault so readily, he finally said. Fewer still would act to correct harm they caused accidentally. I misjudged you, and for that I apologize. I released a sigh of relief, glad that I could clear up the misunderstanding. And I knew that the ancient tree genuinely meant it because once again, I felt Du Yenz's spiritual pressure surge upward, carrying me from the middle of the crowned heart realm to the late stage. Yay! Bloom clapped her tiny branches together. Papa isn't angry anymore, and the nice mister is getting stronger. Before I could respond to her innocent enthusiasm, I became acutely aware that my backside was thoroughly soaked. Throughout my experiments, I'd noticed the boulder beneath me becoming increasingly damp, but I'd attributed it to morning dew or some other natural phenomenon. Now it was impossible to ignore. The rock was practically streaming with moisture. Right? I muttered, standing up and brushing off Du Yenz's robes. I think I've been sitting long enough anyway. The moment I stepped away from the boulder, a voice spoke up from below, nervous, apologetic, and deeply embarrassed. Please forgive this worthless seat, Divine Master. This pathetic stone knows it has failed in its most basic function. To allow the magnificent one's robes to become damp is an unforgivable transgression. This servant has brought shame upon all stones everywhere. I stared down at what I'd assumed was an ordinary piece of granite. Du Yenz's spiritual sense, enhanced by his recent advancement, immediately detected the presence hiding within the stone. Peak-crowned heart realm. This boulder was a crowned heart realm cultivator, and apparently it had been serving as my meditation seat for the past several hours while slowly sweating from anxiety. "You're a cultivator," I said, more statement than question. "The Stone Emperor of Eternal Destiny," the boulder proclaimed, then immediately deflated. "Though clearly this worthless one has proven unworthy of such titles by failing to provide adequate seating comfort. Please, Divine Master, punish this servant for its inadequacy. You're a peak-crowned heart realm expert and you've been pretending to be furniture." "Not pretending, Master. Serving." When this one felt your overwhelming power, it immediately recognized its proper place in the cosmic order. What greater honor could exist than to serve as a throne for one who commands forces beyond mortal comprehension? I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. Just how many lives had I unknowingly affected? "I'm going to try something," I said, placing my hand against the stone's surface. "This might help you think more clearly." I began channeling chi into the boulder's spiritual structure, expecting to find the remnant effects of the same kind of blue sun manipulation I had encountered with the trees. But except for the evolution of the creature's Xianyi, nothing else happened. The Stone Emperor's consciousness was exactly as it appeared, terrified with no trace of external influence. I tried again, pushing more chi through the connection, searching for any sign of artificial compulsion or programmed loyalty. Still nothing. "Master?" The Stone Emperor's voice quavered with worry. "Have I displeased you? Is my spiritual foundation too flawed to accept your divine energy?" I stepped back, frowning. The blue sun energy effects hadn't lasted on the Stone Emperor like they had on the trees. Whether that was because of the Stone Emperor's superior cultivation level, or because the effect was more effective on plant-based life forms, I didn't know. All I knew was that the Stone Emperor wasn't being mind-controlled. "You're actually choosing to be a chair," I said, still struggling to process this. "The most honored chair in all existence," the Stone Emperor declared with what sounded like genuine pride. "To support the weight of one who can casually manipulate the fundamental forces of consciousness itself. Surely there is no greater purpose for a mere stone." It seems I had terrified the poor stone to the extent that it had decided that the safest course of action was to serve as my personal furniture. This also explained why its subservience didn't have the same effect on Du Yenz's cultivation as the ancient tree. With a sigh, I looked at the sweating boulder, then at the two trees who were watching this exchange with fascination, then back at the boulder. This realm was going to drive me insane. "Master," Azure whispered, "there's something wrong with this place." I couldn't help but agree, and it seemed to have something to do with this Xianyi that was messing with people's heads. Extending my left hand, I summoned a small amount of chi, letting the familiar spiritual energy dance around my fingers. In my right hand, I called forth some of the local Xianyi, watching as the belief-based energy swirled in chaotic patterns. When I'd compared chi to harmonic essence back in the realm of living lyrics, I'd noticed some differences but mainly similarities, which made sense as chi was nothing more than a higher and more refined form. But looking at chi and Xianyi side by side, they seemed fundamentally different. Chi flowed with natural laws and cosmic principles. Xianyi moved according to will and conviction. I let the chi dissipate and replaced it with blue sun energy. Now this was interesting. Both blue sun energy and Xianyi specialized in creation and manipulation of consciousness. Both seemed designed to drive their users towards different forms of madness. And clearly, blue sun energy didn't need to use its normal subtle insidious method to exert its influence on the locals. It could override and reprogram Xianyi with disturbing ease. "Master," Azure said quietly, "are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" I stared at the swirling Xianyi in my palm, feeling pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. The familiar unsettling sensation I'd been getting from Xianyi ever since arriving in this realm wasn't because it was a derivative of a stable form of energy like Qi. It was because Xianyi was derivative of a corrupted energy source, blue sun energy. Which also meant whoever had created the realm of the Chosen had either personally visited the Two Suns world, or had learned about blue sun energy from someone who had. There was another world walker. "Master," Azure's voice carried a note of grim confirmation. I've been analyzing the energy patterns since we arrived, and I have to agree with your conclusion. The similarities between Xianyi and Blue Sun energy aren't superficial, they're fundamental. At the deepest level, Xianyi really is a derivative of Blue Sun energy. I stayed silent for a long moment, letting this revelation settle into my understanding of the situation. In a Xianxia world where the impossible became routine, I'd always known it was likely that I wasn't the only world walker. Whether that was because someone else had cultivated the World Tree Sutra, or they had developed a completely different method to traverse realities, I'd always accepted there was a possibility that during my cultivation journey I would encounter another. But what I hadn't expected was to come across one, or at least the influence of one, without having even left my sect. The realm of the Chosen belonged to the Azure Peak sect, whether because it had originally belonged to a former civilization realm member or through some kind of acquisition, which meant either the World Walker was an Azure Peak member, past or present, or was someone closely associated with the sect. I frowned, considering the implications. From what I'd observed, I felt it was unlikely that the creator of this realm of the Chosen was actually a World Walker themselves. This inner world didn't have the telltale signs I would expect. No variety of energy systems from different worlds. No obvious influence of multiple civilizations' cultures blended together. It was more probable that the creator of this realm had been associated with a World Walker, and had possibly been given Blue Sun energy to experiment with. From those experimentations, Xianyi had been born. I already knew that life realm and civilization realm experts would go through extraordinary lengths to experiment with foreign energy types. It was one of the reasons I'd hidden the Two Suns energies for so long. While all inner worlds started with Qi as their foundation, once a cultivator entered the civilization realm, the cultivation methods used by their inhabitants became a huge factor in progressing their own advancement. Having a more unique energy type could contribute significantly to that progression, especially if it complemented the cultivator's primary cultivation method. So, the scenario I was imagining went something like this. A cultivator had developed an inner world based on the Tao of belief, probably someone with genuine conviction and noble intentions. Then they encountered a World Walker who had visited the Two Suns world and somehow obtained Blue Sun energy samples. Seeing that Blue Sun energy specialized in creation and consciousness manipulation, the cultivator had probably thought it was perfectly suited for their people, much better than pure Qi for a realm focused on belief and conviction. Unfortunately, as I'd learned through painful experience, Blue Sun energy was fundamentally corrupted. It only made sense that anything derived from it would also carry that corruption, like a spiritual virus that transformed whatever it touched. This would explain why the realm had shifted from being based on the pure Tao of belief into what I was witnessing now, a reality following the Tao of delusion, where every single thing was convinced of its own importance to an absurd degree. The corruption had likely driven the original cultivator insane as well, which would explain why this inner world had eventually been absorbed by the sect and was now being used for tournaments rather than being actively maintained by its creator. "Master," Azure said quietly, "this is exactly why you've been so cautious about sharing the Two Suns energies with Wei Lin and the others, isn't it?" "Yes," I replied internally. "Until I have a permanent method to purify them, something more reliable than the Genesis Seeds protection that I can extend to others, I won't put anyone else at risk." But what concerned me most was a more fundamental question. Had the World Walker knowingly or unknowingly spread this poisonous energy? The answer to that would tell me what kind of person I might eventually encounter. If they'd known Blue Sun energy was corrupted and had shared it anyway, that painted a picture of someone either malicious or recklessly irresponsible. If they'd been ignorant of the corruption, it suggested someone who might be a potential ally, someone I could warn about the dangers they'd unknowingly spread. It would also give me some idea of when the World Walker had visited the Two Suns world, and whether they might still be making trips there. I'd traveled to the Two Suns world multiple times, yet I'd never come across anything that suggested others from the cultivation world had also visited. No traces of Qi-based cultivation, no rumors among the locals of strange foreigners with impossible abilities, no signs of advanced techniques being introduced from outside their reality. This suggested several possibilities. Either the World Walker had kept an extremely low profile during their visits, not leaving any lasting imprint on that world, or they'd visited years, possibly centuries or millennia, ago, and their actions had been lost to time. There was also the possibility that the time loop the two suns world was locked in had erased their mark once each cycle concluded, though that seemed less likely. Cal would remember previous loops, and given his personality, he would definitely have been interested in a world walker and how that could help the two suns world situation. But from my experience with him, Cal hadn't shown any signs of knowing such a thing was even possible. I shook my head. There just wasn't enough concrete information. Without knowing the time differences between the realm of the Chosen and the cultivation world, it would be difficult to determine when the creator of this world had first introduced Xian-Yi to their inhabitants, which meant it would be nearly impossible to figure out when the World Walker had originally shown them Blue Sun energy. And when you factored in the two suns world being locked in a time loop for who knows how long, the timeline became completely impossible to untangle. Unauthorized tail usage. If you spot this story on Amazon, report the violation. For all I knew, this World Walker could have done all of this thousands of years ago and was long dead by now. Or I could just be wrong about the entire thing. Regardless, when I return to the sect, it'd be best to keep an eye out for any information about World Walkers. If anyone would have answers about such things, it would be Sect Master Yuan. While he wasn't obligated to tell me anything, Yuan had seemed like a reasonable person during our brief encounter, and I might be able to learn something from him. But what I needed to do right now was prepare for my battle with Yuan Jin. After that concluded, I could spend time learning more about this world and its creator before leaving the realm. Just as I was about to start working on a proper battle strategy, I felt a familiar stirring in the back of my mind. Du Yanzi was coming back online. This was always the trickiest part of using someone as a vessel. Unlike my experiences in the realm of living lyrics, where I'd worked as a true partner with Mo Yuhang from the beginning, Du Yanzi had been knocked out immediately upon entry, and now that some time had passed, his natural consciousness was reasserting itself. I felt the moment his awareness fully returned, like a second stream of thought suddenly joining the river of my own consciousness. Where am I? You're in your body, I replied carefully, but you're sharing it with me. I'm the divine being who chose you as a vessel. Remember, a divine being? There was wonder in his voice, but also something else. A wariness that surprised me. I remember. I called out to you. I was desperate. Everything was falling apart, and I thought. He trailed off, and I could sense him examining our shared consciousness more carefully. This is real, isn't it? You're actually here in my body. I'd expected the hot-headed protagonist type, someone who would immediately start talking about how he was chosen by destiny, how this proved his grandfather right about his special nature. But this Du Yanzi seemed almost normal. There was intelligence behind his voice, a thoughtfulness that didn't match the delusional young master I'd been prepared for. Are you all right? I asked, genuinely curious about his mental state. I think so. Everything feels different, though. Clearer. Like I was looking at the world through dirty glass and someone finally cleaned it. Interesting. Du Yanzi had been on the verge of becoming a disbeliever when I'd chosen him. His faith in his own destiny completely shattered. But this wasn't the bitter emptiness I'd expect from someone who'd lost all hope, or the manic energy I'd expect from someone clinging onto the last scraps of hope. Instead, he seemed oddly at peace. Then it hit me. When I channeled Qi earlier, it had evolved not just the ambient Xian-Yi, but also the energy flowing through Du Yanzi's spiritual channels. The same purification effect that had freed the trees from Blue Sun programming had worked on my vessel's own cultivation base. But since the corrupted Xian-Yi didn't affect my mental state, I didn't even realize. I had just assumed the experiment had failed. Du Yanzi, I said slowly, how do you feel about your destiny? About being chosen? Honestly, I'm not sure I care anymore. His voice carried a rueful chuckle. For years, I built my entire identity around being special, being destined for greatness. But looking back on it now, that obsession made me miserable. I was so focused on proving I was the hero of my own story that I forgot to actually live. Fascinating. The Qi had indeed purified his Xian-Yi, but instead of making him doubt everything like a disbeliever, it had given him perspective. He could still believe in things. He just wasn't compelled to believe in grandiose delusions about himself. Wait! Du Yanzi's voice suddenly sharpened with alarm. What is that enormous tree doing? And why is there a boulder looking at me? I glanced up at the ancient oak, whose massive form was indeed rather intimidating when you weren't expecting it. The stone emperor had positioned itself so it could observe everything, and its craggy surface did have an unmistakably watchful quality. Those are my friends, I explained internally. The tree is called, well, he never mentioned a name, and the boulder calls himself the Stone Emperor. They're both cultivators, actually. There was a moment of stunned silence before Du Yenza spoke again. You have witnesses of fate who are trees and rocks. Something like that, though it's more complicated. Is that unusual? I asked, genuinely curious about local customs. Most cultivators have human followers, Du Yenza replied, still sounding stunned. Maybe spirit beasts if they're particularly accomplished. But I've never heard of someone whose witnesses of fate included geological formations and ancient trees. As he said this, an interesting thought occurred to me. I looked around the small forest clearing, noting the various plants and rocks scattered throughout. The ancient oak had been freed from my compulsion and chosen to respect me anyway. Little Bloom had been given awareness and decided I was nice entirely on her own. The Stone Emperor remained terrified, but that was due to my accidental intimidation rather than programmed subservience. What if I could awaken more of them? Not as servants or worshippers, but as truly independent beings who happened to think I was worth supporting. In a realm where belief literally shaped reality, having genuine believers, rather than manufactured ones, could be incredibly powerful. And unlike the corrupted Blue Sun approach, adding chi to the equation when granting consciousness would likely preserve free will. The awakened beings would retain their ability to think critically and make their own choices. The idea was intriguing, but I'd need to be careful. Even positive consciousness creation was a serious responsibility. Every being I awakened would be a real person with real needs and desires, not just a tool for my advancement. Still, the potential was fascinating. In a world where everyone believed they were the protagonist, maybe the real power came from being the one who helped others write their own stories. City Lord Feng Zhaoyang stood at the highest balcony of his palace, gazing out over the Prosperity District with the kind of casual authority that came from 3 centuries of unchallenged rule. The morning sun caught the gold thread in his ceremonial robes, each strand carefully woven with Xian Yi to reinforce his position as the city's ultimate arbiter of order and justice. At the world-writ sovereign stage, Feng Zhaoyang had long ago transcended the petty struggles that consumed lesser cultivators. Where those at the crowned heart realm still fought to maintain their beliefs against the doubts of others, he had moved beyond such vulnerabilities. His convictions were no longer fragile things that could be shattered by humiliation or failure. Instead, they had crystallized into absolute truth, written directly into the fabric of reality itself. The difference was both profound and practical. A crowned heart cultivator could manifest their beliefs as spiritual pressure and phantom crowns, but their power remained dependent on maintaining those beliefs. Doubt from others could literally wound them, criticism could destabilize their cultivation base, and a crisis of doubt could unravel years of advancement in minutes. But a world-writ sovereign? Feng Zhaoyang's beliefs had become universal laws within his domain. He didn't need to convince anyone of his authority. He simply carved it into existence using Xian Yi calligraphy that rewrote local reality. When he declared, "I am the rightful ruler of this city," the declaration became a fundamental truth that even the Tao itself acknowledged. Challenging his authority wasn't just difficult. It was metaphysically impossible for anyone below his cultivation stage. Only another world-writ sovereign, or someone who had advanced to the heavens beloved stage or beyond, possessed the spiritual weight necessary to contest his reality alterations. Anyone else would find their opposition simply written out of existence. "My lord," Captain Ji Haozhe said from behind him, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone who understood exactly what kind of power he was addressing. "Yesterday's reports have been confirmed. 3 separate groups of witnesses saw Du Yenza destroy cultivation techniques using methods consistent with disbeliever abilities." Feng Zhaoyang didn't turn around immediately. He'd been expecting the boy to break for months, though he was genuinely surprised it had taken 9 consecutive defeats. Most cultivators would have given up after the fourth or fifth humiliation, their belief in their own chosenness cracking under the weight of repeated failure. The typical pattern was predictable. After enough defeats, a cultivator would simply transfer their faith from themselves to their conqueror, becoming a witness of fate who believed their opponent was the true chosen one. Du Yanzi's transformation into a disbeliever was far more unusual, far more dangerous, but also far less likely to be true. "Tell me about the witnesses," Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "I find it hard to believe that Du Yanzi, for all his failures, has truly made such a dramatic transformation. These reports have a tendency to grow in the telling." The requirement for 3 separate witness groups wasn't arbitrary. Feng Xiaoyang had learned from bitter experience that single accusers were often unreliable. Too many jealous rivals had come forward over the years, claiming their opponents were disbelievers simply because they couldn't accept being defeated in honest combat. The 3-group verification system helped filter out false reports born of wounded pride and petty revenge. The first group consisted of merchants and shopkeepers in the Eastern District who observed the confrontation from their stalls. They all reported seeing Du Yanzi nullify a blazing phoenix descent technique by apparently denying its validity. Captain Ji Haozhe paused, consulting his notes. The second group was composed of city guards on patrol, led by Guard Captain Dong. They witnessed Du Yanzi cause a flight technique to fail simply by being present. The third group, he hesitated. The third group were the Lu clan cultivators who challenged Du Yanzi directly in the street. According to their collective testimony, Du Yanzi destroyed their techniques without even moving, just by looking at them with contempt. Feng Xiaoyang finally turned, his expression now showing signs of alarm. "And the boy's current location?" "Unknown, my lord." After the confrontation, several guards attempted to apprehend him, but Du Yanzi demonstrated flight capabilities that shouldn't have been possible for a disbeliever. He disappeared into the Eastern District with his servant. "We've been searching, but tracking a disbeliever is complicated," Feng Xiaoyang finished. It was one of the many dangers that made these corrupted individuals so threatening. Their ability to deny the validity of detection techniques made conventional pursuit methods unreliable at best. Love this story? Find the genuine version on the author's preferred platform and support their work. The city lord walked to his desk, where maps of the surrounding area lay spread across the polished surface. Each district was marked with different colored pins representing the cultivation levels and loyalties of the local power structures. The Eastern District, he noted, contained several locations that might appeal to someone seeking isolation. "Captain," he said, tracing his finger along the marked paths leading out of the city. "In your professional opinion, where would a newly awakened disbeliever seek refuge?" The captain considered this carefully. Ji Haozhe had previously served the royal family, and his experience with tracking dangerous cultivators was extensive. "Somewhere isolated, my lord. Disbelievers can't maintain their abilities around large groups of believers. The collective faith tends to pressure them back toward normal Xian-Yi patterns. They need space to solidify their new worldview." "The abandoned shrine," Feng Xiaoyang said, his finger stopping at a small mark on the eastern edge of the city's influence. "The one where the last priest became a disbeliever himself." "That would make sense, my lord. The spiritual corruption there would actually support rather than hinder his development." Feng Xiaoyang nodded slowly. The shrine had been a persistent problem for years. After the priest's transformation, the location had become spiritually unstable, resistant to normal purification techniques. Most citizens avoided it entirely, believing the place to be cursed. Which, from a certain perspective, it was. "Prepare a full squadron," Feng Xiaoyang commanded. "But keep them at a distance. I'll handle the actual apprehension personally." Captain Ji Haozhe looked concerned. "My lord, surely a full world-writ sovereign's power isn't necessary for a former crowned heart cultivator? Even accounting for their reality denial abilities." "You're thinking like a normal cultivator," Feng Xiaoyang replied, walking toward his private armory. "Disbelievers aren't just dangerous because of what they can do to techniques. They're dangerous because of what they represent. the possibility that all of our beliefs, all of our carefully constructed realities, might be nothing more than shared delusions. He selected a scroll from the armory's shelves, its surface covered with golden calligraphy that seemed to shift and flow even when not being actively powered. This was one of his personal Xianyi inscriptions, a reality-altering technique that would allow him to impose his will directly onto the local environment. A disbeliever's very existence is a challenge to the fundamental nature of our realm, he continued, tucking the scroll into his robes. If word spreads that Du Yanzi has successfully transitioned, others might attempt the same path. We could face a spiritual epidemic that undermines the entire cultivation system. Captain Ji Haojia's face paled as he considered the implications. An entire generation of cultivators rejecting belief itself. Exactly. Which is why this needs to be handled swiftly and definitively. Feng Xiaoyang moved toward the balcony's edge, gathering Xianyi around himself like a cloak of absolute authority. Du Yanzi was once a promising young cultivator from a respected clan. His transformation into a disbeliever is unfortunate but will serve as a perfect example of what happens to those who abandon their faith in destiny. The flight to the Eastern District took less than 5 minutes at Feng Xiaoyang's cultivation level. As a world-rich sovereign, his movement techniques didn't simply propel him through the air. They declared his right to be wherever he chose to be, reality adjusting accordingly. The wind itself seemed to part before him, acknowledging his authority over the local environment. The abandoned shrine came into view as he crested the last hill, its crumbling walls and moss-covered stones looking exactly as pathetic as he remembered. Withered trees surrounded the building like skeletal guardians, their branches reaching toward the sky in attitudes of permanent supplication. The spiritual energy here felt stagnant and wrong, like a wound in the fabric of reality that had never properly healed. But there, sitting peacefully on a boulder near the shrine's rear wall, was Du Yanzi. Feng Xiaoyang descended slowly, allowing his spiritual pressure to build gradually. The technique was both practical and psychological. Most cultivators would feel the approaching power and either flee or prostrate themselves in submission. He was curious to see how a disbeliever would react to genuine world-rich sovereign authority. Du Yanzi looked up as he landed, and Feng Xiaoyang immediately noticed the changes. The desperate hunger for validation that had characterized the boy's previous public appearances was gone, replaced by an almost unsettling calm. His posture was relaxed, confident, but not in the manic way of someone clinging to delusions of grandeur. This was the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. More troubling was the phantom crown floating above Du Yanzi's head. The boy had somehow broken through to the peak of the crowned heart realm, which should have been impossible for someone in the midst of transitioning to disbeliever status. The two paths were mutually exclusive. You couldn't simultaneously embrace and reject the concept of personal destiny. Were the reports about the boy becoming a disbeliever false? The only way to know for certain was through a thorough examination. Du Yanzi, Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice carrying just enough Xianyi to ensure it would be heard clearly. I am City Lord Feng Xiaoyang. You are under arrest for violations of public order and suspected spiritual corruption. The elderly servant, Li Chong, immediately began moving toward a kowtowing position, but Du Yanzi gestured for him to remain seated. City Lord Feng, Du Yanzi replied politely. I'm honored by your personal attention, though I'm not sure what laws I've broken. The cultivation duels were all conducted within legal parameters, and I harmed no one permanently. Feng Xiaoyang studied the young man carefully. This wasn't the bitter nihilism he expected from a disbeliever, nor the desperate bravado of someone trying to maintain failing beliefs. Du Yanzi spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was and felt no need to justify it to others. The reports indicate you may have demonstrated disbeliever abilities, Feng Xiaoyang said, watching carefully for any reaction. Reality denial, technique nullification, spiritual corruption of the local environment. I need to verify whether these claims have any merit. I see. Du Yanzi nodded thoughtfully. And if they do have merit, what would be the penalty? Spiritual reconditioning if you're cooperative. Permanent imprisonment if you're not. Execution if you prove too dangerous to contain. Du Yenza considered this for a moment, then shook his head. I'm afraid I'll have to decline those options, City Lord. I've just discovered who I really am, and I have no intention of letting anyone convince me to be someone else again. Feng Xiaoyang felt his patience beginning to thin. The boy's casual rejection of lawful authority was exactly the kind of thinking that made disbelievers so dangerous. They didn't just doubt their own specialness. They doubted everyone else's right to define reality. This is not a negotiation, Feng Xiaoyang said, allowing his world-rich sovereign's spiritual pressure to flare outward. The technique should have been overwhelming, a manifestation of absolute authority that made resistance psychologically impossible. You will surrender yourself for examination, or you will be taken by force. That's when the forest began to move. Feng Xiaoyang had seen many strange things in his 3 centuries of life, but watching an ancient oak tree slowly turn its massive trunk to face him with what could only be described as indignation was definitely a new experience. How dare you threaten our benefactor? The tree rumbled, its voice carrying the weight of centuries and the kind of righteous fury that made the ground itself tremble. This human has shown us kindness, and you arrive here speaking of imprisonment and spiritual reconditioning? The city lord's eyes widened as he took in the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just one corrupted tree. The entire forest was responding to his presence with open hostility. Branches creaked and swayed despite the absence of wind, and he could feel dozens of awakened consciousnesses focusing their attention on him with unmistakable disapproval. Papa! A small, frightened voice piped up from behind the oak's massive trunk. Papa, why is the bad man making the air hurt? Is he going to take the nice Mr. away? A tiny sapling, no more than 3 feet tall, peeked out from behind the ancient oak with wide, innocent eyes. Her leaves trembled with fear as she stared at Feng Xiaoyang, and despite everything, the city lord felt a twinge of guilt. The little tree couldn't be more than a few hours old, based on her spiritual signature. Yet she was already displaying the kind of genuine concern and affection that took humans years to develop. It made the city lord sick seeing Du Yenza lead such an innocent creature astray. Don't worry, little bloom, the oak said gently, one of his lower branches reaching down to pat the sapling's delicate form. Papa won't let the mean man hurt our friend. That's right, called out another voice, this one coming from a boulder that had apparently decided to roll closer to the confrontation. The Stone Emperor won't stand for injustice. Anyone who threatens him threatens us all. More voices began joining the chorus, and Feng Xiaoyang felt his blood run cold as he realized the true scope of what he was dealing with. A patch of singing grass had formed what looked suspiciously like a choir formation, their harmonized voices declaring Du Yenza to be the melody of truth. Several smaller trees were calling him the awakener of consciousness, while a family of rabbits that had apparently gained sentience were chanting Great Liberator over and over again. This was far, far worse than the reports had indicated. The city lord's mind raced back to his youth, when his master had first explained the true danger of disbelievers. He'd been barely into the proclamation realm then, accompanying Master Bohin on what should have been a routine arrest of a corrupted cultivator. Remember, Xiaoyang, Master Bohin had said as they approached the ramshackle hut where the disbeliever had taken refuge. These abominations don't just doubt their own destiny. They spread that doubt like a spiritual plague. The longer they remain free, the more damage they do to the very fabric of our realm. The disbeliever they'd arrested that day had been a broken thing, a former crowned heart realm expert whose wife had left him for a greater man, causing him to lose faith in his own chosenness. And then, in his corrupted state, he'd managed to gather what the texts called echoes of emptiness, those who had begun to resonate with his nihilistic worldview. Feng Xiaoyang remembered how the man's few followers had fought with desperate fury, not because they believed in the disbeliever's greatness, but because they'd been convinced that everything they'd once thought meaningful was a lie. They'd attacked the arrest party with the fervor of people who had nothing left to lose, because they truly believed there was nothing worth preserving. The more echoes of emptiness a disbeliever gathered, the stronger their reality-denying abilities became. It was a feedback loop of destruction that could theoretically spiral out of control until entire regions fell into spiritual nihilism. Li Chong, Feng Xiaoyang called out. Step away from the corrupted individual. You're clearly under some form of spiritual influence. The elderly servant moved protectively closer to Du Yanzi instead of obeying. With all due respect, City Lord, I think you're the one who's confused. Young Master Du isn't corrupted. He's finally become what he was always meant to be. That settled it. Whatever was happening here, it had to be stopped before it could spread any further. Unauthorized duplication. This tale has been taken without consent. Report sightings. This has gone on for long enough, Feng Xiaoyang said, letting his world-rich sovereign's spiritual pressure explode outward like a crushing wave. Little Bloom's scream cut through the air as she was pressed flat against the ground by the overwhelming force. The flowering bushes withered under the pressure, their petals falling like tears. Even the massive oak groaned as its branches bent toward the earth, though it somehow managed to remain upright. You are all under arrest for harboring a dangerous spiritual deviant, Feng Xiaoyang declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute law. Surrender now and your corruption may yet be cleansed. Du Yanzi remained standing in the face of the crushing aura, though Feng Xiaoyang noted with satisfaction that sweat was beading on the young man's forehead. Good. Even corrupted cultivators had their limits. I gave you a chance to come peacefully, Feng Xiaoyang continued, reaching into his robes for the scroll he'd prepared. Since you refuse, I'll have to use force. The scroll unfurled with a sound like thunder, revealing lines of golden calligraphy. This was one of his most powerful techniques, chains of absolute binding, written in the reality-altering script that only world-rich sovereigns and above could master. Feng Xiaoyang began to channel his Xian Yi into the characters, watching as they lifted off the scroll and began to expand into three-dimensional constructs. The golden chains materialized in the air around Du Yanzi, fully ready to bind him completely. Let absolute authority crush all defiance, Feng Xiaoyang chanted, pouring more power into the technique. Let the will of heaven. Stop, Du Yanzi said calmly. It seems while Feng Xiaoyang had been busy preparing his own technique, Du Yanzi had already produced his own scroll and brush, and wrote his own character, Stop. The blue calligraphy shot forward like a guided arrow, colliding directly with Feng Xiaoyang's golden chains. The impact sent shockwaves through the air as the two techniques clashed, blue light wrestling against gold, in a spectacular display of conflicting spiritual energies. Feng Xiaoyang's chains didn't just halt. They began to unravel, their golden radiance dimming as the blue light consumed them from within. The written character seemed to devour his technique, growing brighter with each link it dissolved. In seconds, his carefully crafted chains of absolute binding dissolved into harmless motes of spiritual energy. The city lord stared at Du Yanzi in complete bewilderment. That's impossible. How can a disbeliever use calligraphy? That's a world-rich sovereign technique. Du Yanzi tucked the brush away casually, though Feng Xiaoyang could see the effort the counter-technique had cost him. I told you I wasn't what you think I am. But Feng Xiaoyang's mind reeled as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed. Disbelievers can't use belief-based techniques. It's fundamentally incompatible with their nature. Calligraphy wasn't just writing. It was the direct inscription of one's will onto reality itself. It required absolute faith in one's authority to command the world through written word. A true disbeliever would be incapable of such techniques, because doubt corroded the very foundation the art required. Which meant either Du Yanzi wasn't actually a disbeliever, or he was something far more dangerous than anything Feng Xiaoyang had encountered before. What are you? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Du Yanzi considered the question for a moment, absently reaching down to pat Little Bloom's trembling leaves as she cowered near his feet. I'm someone who believes in what I've seen and experienced, rather than what I've been told I should believe. The distinction sent chills down Feng Xiaoyang's spine. This wasn't a disbeliever in the traditional sense, someone who'd lost all faith in their own destiny. This was something far more complex and potentially catastrophic. A hybrid. Someone who could use the techniques of a believer while maintaining the reality-denying abilities of a disbeliever. someone who could inspire loyalty while undermining the fundamental assumptions that held their entire cultivation system together. Feng Xiaoyang's hands trembled as he realized the full scope of what he was facing. Du Yanzi wasn't just a threat to public order, he was a threat to the very nature of their realm, which meant there was only one way to deal with him. Du Yanzi, Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice taking on the formal cadence required for what he was about to propose. I challenge you to a clash of convictions. The forest fell silent. Even the awakened spirits seemed to understand the gravity of what had just been proposed. A clash of convictions was the most dangerous type of spiritual combat known to the realm of the chosen. It wasn't a battle of techniques or power. It was a direct confrontation between opposing worldviews, where two cultivators would expose their fundamental beliefs to each other and attempt to prove which perspective reflected true reality. The process was terrifying because it was absolute. When believers and disbelievers engaged in such a clash, they would literally attempt to convert each other through pure spiritual pressure and logical argument. The loser wouldn't just be defeated. They would have their entire worldview shattered and replaced by their opponent's perspective. A believer who lost would become a disbeliever, their faith in destiny permanently destroyed. A disbeliever who lost would regain their clarity, once again becoming a believer in their destiny and the destiny of others. It was the only known method for truly converting someone from one path to the other, but it came with enormous risks for both parties. Even the winner often emerged psychologically scarred from the experience of having their deepest beliefs challenged so directly. Many cultivators who survived such clashes never fully recovered their original confidence, haunted by the memory of how close they had come to losing everything they believed in. For Feng Xiaoyang, it represented both his greatest fear and his only hope. If he won, Du Yanzi would become a proper believer again, his dangerous delusion replaced by belief of destiny. The threat to the cultivation system would be eliminated, and order would be restored. If he lost, Feng Xiaoyang would become the very thing he sought to destroy, stripped of his certainties and forced to see the world through the unclear, terrible lens of delusion. Du Yanzi studied the city lord for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than afraid. Around them, the forest spirits watched with something approaching reverence, as if they understood they were witnessing a moment that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the entire region. Very well, City Lord, Du Yanzi said finally. I accept your challenge. A clash of convictions wasn't something undertaken lightly, even by someone of the City Lord's cultivation level. The spiritual techniques required to properly conduct such a confrontation demanded absolute precision and unwavering commitment to one's own worldview. Any hesitation, any moment of doubt, and the entire framework of beliefs that sustained his power could come crashing down. Very well, Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice carrying the formal authority required for such proceedings. Let the ancient rites be observed. He began gathering his xianyi, but not for attack or defense. Instead, he was weaving it into the complex spiritual matrix that would allow their opposing worldviews to clash directly, without the interference of normal reality. The technique was called Chamber of Absolute Truth, and it created a pocket dimension where pure belief could confront pure belief without external distraction. Golden light began emanating from Feng Xiaoyang's body as his world-writ sovereign cultivation manifested the ritual space. The abandoned shrine around them shimmered and faded, replaced by an infinite white void that stretched in all directions. Here, there were no trees to offer comfort, no rocks to provide stability, no external influences to cloud the purity of their confrontation. Just two men and their fundamental understanding of reality. Du Yanzi stood calmly in the center of the void, his phantom crown still floating above his head despite the transition. The sight troubled Feng Xiaoyang more than he cared to admit. By all rights, a disbeliever shouldn't have been able to maintain such a clear symbol of belief-based cultivation within the chamber of absolute truth. The rules are simple, Feng Xiaoyang explained, though he suspected Du Yanzi already understood them. We each present our understanding of the true nature of reality. We defend our position against challenge and criticism. The one whose worldview proves more consistent, more complete, more aligned with fundamental truth, will emerge victorious. And the loser? Du Yanzi asked, though his tone suggested the question was rhetorical. The loser will have their perspective completely replaced by the winner's. If I lose, I become what you are. If you lose, you return to proper belief. Feng Xiaoyang paused, studying the young man's reaction. Are you prepared for that possibility? To once again embrace the very concepts you've rejected. Du Yanzi smiled, and there was something genuinely peaceful about the expression. I'm prepared for whatever truth emerges from this conversation, City Lord. The question is, are you? The casual confidence in that response sent the first chill of unease through Feng Xiaoyang's mind, but he pushed the feeling aside. 3 centuries of successful rule, 3 centuries of seeing his beliefs validated by reality itself, couldn't be wrong. Whatever corruption had taken hold of Du Yanzi, whatever delusions he'd embraced, they would crumble before properly grounded conviction. I'll begin, Feng Xiaoyang declared, allowing his spiritual pressure to flow into the void around them. I speak for the Tao of belief, the fundamental truth that shapes our realm and gives meaning to existence itself. The white space around them began to shift, taking on the golden hue of his Xian Yi as he imposed his understanding onto their shared environment. Images began forming in the air between them. Scenes of cultivators achieving impossible feats through sheer conviction. Cities rising from nothing because their builders believed in their vision. Entire landscapes reshaping themselves to accommodate the will of those with sufficient faith in their own destiny. Look around you, Feng Xiaoyang said, gesturing to the manifesting visions. Everything worthwhile in our realm exists because someone believed it should exist. Every advancement in cultivation, every triumph over adversity, every moment of genuine transcendence. All of it comes from the power of unshakable conviction. The images shifted to show the great cultivators of history. Patriarch Zhou, who had carved mountains with his bare hands because he believed no obstacle could stand before him. Empress Li, who had united warring clans through the sheer force of her conviction that peace was possible. The legendary formation master Wan, who had created the great defensive arrays protecting their major cities because he refused to accept that anything was impossible. The Tao of belief teaches us that reality is mutable, subject to the will of those with sufficient faith in their own potential. Feng Xiaoyang continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. When we truly believe in our destiny, when we embrace our role as chosen ones in the great tapestry of existence, we gain the power to reshape the world according to our vision. He turned to Du Yanzi, his eyes blazing with golden light. This is why disbelievers are so dangerous. Not because they're powerful in their own right, but because they seek to convince others that this fundamental truth is a lie. They spread the poison of doubt, undermining the very foundation that allows cultivation to exist. Du Yanzi listened to this lengthy exposition with the patience of someone genuinely interested in understanding an opposing viewpoint. When Feng Xiaoyang finished, he nodded thoughtfully. That's a beautiful philosophy, Du Yanzi said, and to Feng Xiaoyang's surprise, he seemed to mean it. I can see why it appeals to so many people. The idea that conviction alone can overcome any obstacle, that believing in yourself strongly enough makes you capable of anything. It's inspiring. The city lord felt a moment of hope. Perhaps the corruption wasn't as deep as he'd feared. Perhaps there was still enough of the original Du Yanzi left to recognize the truth when it was properly presented. But, Du Yanzi continued, and that single word sent ice through Feng Xiaoyang's veins, I think there's a fundamental flaw in your understanding. The golden light filling the void began to flicker as Du Yanzi's own spiritual pressure started manifesting. You're conflating 2 entirely different concepts, Du Yanzi said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone stating a mathematical proof. You're treating belief based on evidence and experience, as if it's the same thing as belief based on wishful thinking and self-deception. Images began forming in the air around Du Yanzi, but they were fundamentally different from Feng Xiaoyang's grandiose historical visions. These were smaller, more intimate scenes. A farmer carefully observing which seeds grew best in different soils. A craftsman testing various techniques until he found the ones that produced the highest quality work. A healer studying the effects of different herbs on various ailments. True belief, Du Yanzi said, comes from understanding. When that farmer plants his crops, he believes they'll grow, not because he has faith in his own specialness, but because he's observed the natural process countless times. When the craftsman begins a new project, he believes he can complete it, not because destiny favors him, but because he's developed genuine skill through practice and study. Feng Xiaoyang felt his first moment of genuine uncertainty. The argument was more sophisticated than he'd expected, more grounded in observable reality. But he'd faced philosophical challenges before, and he knew how to respond. "You're describing ordinary achievement," Feng Xiaoyang countered, allowing his golden light to reassert itself. "What you call natural process is simply the manifestation of lesser levels of belief. The farmer succeeds because he has faith in the cycles of growth. The craftsman completes his work because he believes in his own competence. These are still examples of conviction shaping reality. A case of literary theft. This tale is not rightfully on Amazon. If you see it, report the violation." "Are they?" Du Yanzi asked, and his tone carried a note of genuine curiosity rather than confrontation. "Or are they examples of people working within natural laws that exist independently of their personal beliefs?" New images began manifesting around Du Yanzi, and these struck directly at the heart of Feng Xiaoyang's worldview. Scenes of cultivators failing despite absolute conviction, of techniques that refused to work regardless of how strongly the practitioner believed in them, of reality stubbornly refusing to bend to even the most passionate faith. "Consider the cultivation failures," Du Yanzi said, his voice remaining calm and reasonable. "Every year, thousands of young cultivators enter sects absolutely convinced they're destined for greatness. They believe in themselves completely, often more strongly than those who actually succeed. Yet most of them never advance beyond the early stages. Why? Feng Xiaoyang had ready answers for this, of course. Because their belief isn't pure enough, isn't deep enough. True conviction requires more than surface-level confidence. It demands fundamental transformation of one's understanding of reality. So, failure is always the fault of insufficient belief? Du Yanzi pressed gently. Never the result of attempting something that simply can't be done? Nothing is impossible for those with sufficient faith. Feng Xiaoyang replied automatically, but even as he spoke the words, he felt a strange hollow sensation in his chest. Really? Du Yanzi tilted his head slightly. Then tell me, City Lord, have you ever witnessed a mortal leap directly to the self-crowned sovereign realm through pure belief alone? Bypassing all the intermediate stages, all the years of cultivation, simply by believing strongly enough in their own importance. The question made Feng Xiaoyang pause. In 3 centuries of life, he had never seen such a thing. Every cultivator he'd known, including himself, had advanced gradually through the stages. Even the most talented prodigies required years to progress from one realm to the next. That's different, he said weakly. Cultivation advancement requires proper foundation building, understanding of spiritual principles. Ah, Du Yanzi said softly. So, you do acknowledge that there are rules governing cultivation. Laws that must be followed regardless of how strongly someone believes they can be broken. Feng Xiaoyang felt a surge of desperation as he recognized the trap closing around him. No, wait. Those aren't limitations on belief itself, they're simply optimal pathways that belief can follow. The stages exist because they represent the most efficient way to channel conviction into power. Really? Du Yanzi's voice remained calm. Then can you bring the dead back to life simply by refusing to accept their demise? That's not. Can you absorb the cultivation of others by believing you deserve their power more than they do? Those examples. Can you leave this world by believing strongly enough in your ability to escape reality? Each question hit like a physical blow. Feng Xiaoyang found himself struggling to maintain the golden light of his Xianyi as doubt began creeping in around the edges of his consciousness. Those examples are irrelevant. He was finally able to cut in, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. No one would attempt such impossible things. Why not? Du Yanzi asked with maddening simplicity. If belief truly shapes reality without limitation, why should anything be impossible? What's the difference between moving a mountain with conviction which we both agree is possible, and reversing the flow of time itself with the same conviction. Feng Xiaoyang opened his mouth to explain the obvious difference, then closed it again as he realized he couldn't articulate what that difference actually was. In the philosophy he'd spent his whole life defending, scale shouldn't matter. If conviction could accomplish one impossible thing, it should be able to accomplish any impossible thing. The difference, he said slowly, grasping for an explanation that made sense, is that some things align with the natural order while others don't. Ah, Du Yanzi said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. So, you do acknowledge that there's a natural order. Laws and principles that exist independently of personal belief. The void around them began shifting again, but this time the change felt different. Less like the imposition of one worldview over another, and more like the gradual revelation of something that had always been there. So, when cultivators succeed, Du Yanzi continued, they're not actually overriding natural laws through sheer conviction. They're learning to work with deeper principles that they didn't previously understand. Their belief is really just confidence in patterns they've observed and techniques they've practiced. Feng Xiaoyang felt the foundation of his understanding beginning to crack. But what about the great cultivators? The legendary figures who achieved impossible feats. Were their feats actually impossible? Du Yanzi asked. Or were they simply very difficult things that required exceptional skill, knowledge, and perhaps access to resources or techniques that aren't widely available? More images manifested around Du Yanzi, and these were the most damaging yet. They showed the legendary cultivators Feng Xiaoyang had referenced earlier, but in a different light. Patriarch Zhou hadn't carved mountains through pure faith. He discovered advanced earth manipulation techniques lost to modern cultivators. Empress Li hadn't united the clans through conviction alone. She'd been a brilliant diplomat and strategist who understood how to appeal to each group's specific interests. Formation Master One hadn't created his arrays by believing impossibility was possible. He'd spent decades studying the flow of spiritual energy and developing innovative applications of well-established principles. Every achievement you attributed to faith, Du Yanzi said, actually comes from knowledge, skill, and hard work. The belief these figures possessed wasn't mystical conviction in their own chosenness. It was rational confidence in their understanding of how things actually work. The golden light surrounding Feng Xiaoyang began to flicker more dramatically. He could feel his Xian Yi becoming unstable as the fundamental assumptions underlying his cultivation started to unravel. But without belief in one's destiny, he protested weakly, why would anyone attempt such difficult achievements? What provides the motivation to persist through countless failures? The same thing that motivates the farmer to plant crops year after year, Du Yanzi replied. The satisfaction of meaningful work, the desire to improve themselves and help others, the simple pleasure of understanding how things work. Purpose doesn't require delusions of cosmic specialness. Feng Xiaoyang staggered as another wave of doubt crashed through his spiritual foundation. The void around them was becoming clearer, less influenced by golden light, more like simple empty space where two people could speak honestly without the interference of imposed beliefs. You're suggesting, Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice barely above a whisper, that everything I've built, everything our realm represents, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. I'm suggesting, Du Yanzi said gently, that you've confused the map with the territory. Belief in your own capability is useful when it's based on genuine knowledge and experience. But belief in your own cosmic importance, your divine chosenness, your special destiny, that's just elaborate self-deception. The images around them shifted one final time, showing the current state of their realm. Cultivators so obsessed with their own significance that they couldn't see the world around them clearly. Rulers making decisions based on grandiose delusions rather than practical wisdom. Entire communities trapped in cycles of competition and conflict because everyone believed they deserved to be the protagonist of reality itself. Look at what this philosophy has created, Du Yanzi said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. A world where everyone is so convinced of their own specialness that they can't work together effectively. Where failure is always blamed on insufficient belief rather than poor planning or unrealistic goals. where people waste their lives chasing impossible dreams instead of pursuing achievable improvements. Feng Xiaoyang fell to his knees as the full weight of the revelation crashed down on him. He could see it now, could see the truth that had been hidden beneath centuries of elaborate self-justification. His rule hadn't been successful because he was chosen by destiny. It had been successful because he'd inherited a stable political system and had the good sense not to disrupt it unnecessarily. His cultivation advancement hadn't come from pure conviction. It had come from access to excellent techniques, experienced teachers, and vast resources. His divine authority wasn't recognition from the heavens. It was the result of fear, habit, and his own ability to impose his will through superior power. The golden Xianyi that had defined his existence for 3 centuries began dissolving. But as it faded, something else took its place. A different kind of spiritual pressure, lighter, happier, and strangely liberating. The pressure of someone who could see through illusions, who could deny the validity of false beliefs, who could strip away comforting lies to reveal uncomfortable truths. Disbeliever spiritual pressure. "I've been a fool," Feng Xiaoyang whispered. "We've all been fools, dancing to the tune of our own delusions, convincing ourselves that our self-importance made us special." Du Yanzi knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Knowledge isn't foolishness, City Lord. You've learned something important today. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?" The void around them began to fade as the clash of convictions reached its natural conclusion. But Feng Xiaoyang barely noticed the transition back to the abandoned shrine. His mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd discovered, the vast scope of the changes that would be necessary if he was going to live according to this new understanding. Everything would have to be reconsidered. His rule, his relationships, his entire approach to cultivation and existence itself. But for the first time in his long life, Feng Xiaoyang felt like he was finally seeing clearly. The clash of convictions was over. The white void around us began to shimmer and crack like breaking glass. Reality reasserted itself in fragments. First the withered trees, then the cracked stone of the abandoned shrine, finally the late afternoon light. The chamber of absolute truth dissolved completely, leaving us standing in the forest clearing where this whole confrontation had begun. I blinked, adjusting to the sudden return of color and texture after that sterile white space. The ancient oak's massive branches swayed despite the absence of wind, and I could feel his attention focused on us with what could only be described as intense curiosity. The Stone Emperor had somehow managed to position himself for the best possible view of our confrontation, which was impressive considering he was basically a large rock. "Benefactor," the oak's voice rumbled. "We witnessed the golden light, but could not perceive what transpired within. Has the threatening one been dealt with appropriately?" I looked down at City Lord Feng Xiaoyang, who was still kneeling in the grass where he'd fallen when his worldview collapsed. His once pristine robes were wrinkled and stained with dirt, his carefully styled hair disheveled. But more importantly, the manic certainty that had defined his spiritual pressure was completely gone. In its place was something I'd never felt before in this realm: actual rationality. "The City Lord has seen the truth," I said carefully, not wanting to embarrass the man further. "He's no longer a threat to anyone." "Remarkable," the Stone Emperor declared. "To witness the fall of a world-rich sovereign. Truly, the Divine Master's power knows no bounds. This unworthy stone feels honored to have provided seating during such a momentous." Mr. Little Bloom's excited voice cut through the Stone Emperor's rambling as she came rushing toward me on her tiny legs. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. She crashed into my legs with surprising force for such a small tree, wrapping her delicate branches around them in what was unmistakably a hug. "You won! You won!" she chirped, her leaves rustling with excitement. "The bad man isn't scary anymore. He's just sitting there looking sad, like when I dropped my favorite pebble in the pond." I reached down and patted her tiny crown of leaves. "That's right, Little Bloom. Everything's okay now." But even as I said it, exhaustion was starting to creep in around the edges of my awareness. The past few hours had been more draining than any physical battle I'd fought since arriving in the tournament. Before the City Lord had even appeared, I'd spent the better part of yesterday and this morning experimenting with my theory about consciousness creation. Using carefully controlled amounts of blue sun energy, I'd managed to awaken several more plants, rocks, and even a family of rabbits. It wasn't as simple as just blasting them with energy and hoping for the best. Each awakening required a delicate touch, enough power to spark awareness, but not so much that I overwhelmed their nascent consciousness with foreign thoughts or programmed loyalty. The ancient oak had been right when he said I'd help them. The blue sun energy, when filtered through qi and applied with careful precision, didn't just grant consciousness, it granted free consciousness. The awakened beings could think their own thoughts, make their own choices. Most had chosen to support me, drawn by genuine gratitude for the gift of awareness and perhaps a natural affinity for the one who'd given it to them. But not all. A particularly stubborn boulder near the shrine's entrance had taken one look at the situation, declared that politics were beneath the dignity of proper stone, and rolled itself into the underbrush to sulk in peace. I hadn't tried to stop it. If anything, its decision had been proof that my method was working correctly. But the process had been exhausting. Each awakening required me to maintain perfect control while channeling energies that wanted to either dominate or corrupt everything they touched. By the time Feng Xiaoyang had arrived with his golden spiritual pressure blazing, I'd been running on fumes. "Master," Azure had whispered in my mind as the City Lord approached. "Your qi and blue sun energy reserves are critically low. Perhaps we should consider a strategic withdrawal." I'd been tempted, but something about the man's absolute certainty had intrigued me. Plus, running away would have looked terrible in front of my newly awakened friends. When Feng Xiaoyang had started his formal arrest speech, I'd deliberately engaged him in conversation to buy time. And when he'd started using calligraphy techniques to try to arrest me, I felt more confident in my theory about Xianyi being a derivative of blue sun energy. After all, in the Two Suns world, calligraphy was the oldest method of blue sun cultivation. The idea that a realm descended from blue sun corruption would develop a calligraphy tradition for beings in the higher stages of cultivation wasn't surprising at all. And then, when I'd pulled out my own brush and ink, channeling blue sun energy directly into the characters I wrote, the poor City Lord hadn't stood a chance. My simple stop character had torn through his chains like they were made of paper. After all, he'd been using a derivative energy to fight against its source. It was like trying to use a candle to overpower the sun. Fortunately for both of us, he'd had the wisdom not to escalate into direct violence after that. Because while my calligraphy demonstration had been effective, it had also used up a significant chunk of my remaining blue sun energy. If he'd kept pushing, I would have had to resort to red sun energy, and that would have gotten messy very quickly. The clash of convictions, on the other hand, had been something I'd felt confident about from the start. "Master," Azure had observed during our philosophical duel. "His entire worldview is built on circular reasoning and wishful thinking. This shouldn't be difficult." And it hadn't been. Feng Xiaoyang's beliefs were fundamentally unstable because they were based on the delusion that personal conviction could override natural laws without limitation. All I'd had to do was keep asking why, until the contradictions became impossible to ignore. But what fascinated me now was what had happened to his spiritual energy afterward. Where the City Lord's aura touched the chaotic, self-aggrandizing energy that filled this realm, it seemed to stabilize and purify it. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, like watching muddy water slowly run clear. It's similar to how qi affects Xianyi, I realized. But instead of forcing an evolution, disbeliever energy seems to slowly strip away the delusions and leave behind something more rational. This story has been unlawfully obtained without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. An interesting parallel, Azure agreed. It suggests that this realm has developed its own immune response to the blue sun corruption. Unfortunately, from what we've observed, that immune response is usually suppressed or eliminated before it can spread. He was right. The blue sun's corruption ran too deep and wouldn't tolerate anything that threatened its control, which meant disbelievers were hunted down and eliminated as soon as they were discovered. Li Chong had been watching the entire confrontation from a respectful distance, but now he approached with obvious excitement radiating from his weathered features. "Divine Master," he said, and I could hear the genuine awe in his voice. "To witness you defeat a world-rich sovereign in philosophical combat. Truly, the Gold Emperor's faith in the young master's destiny has been vindicated." I winced internally. Li Chong was back to the destiny talk, which meant Du Yan's breakthrough, and my performance had probably reinforced all his existing delusions rather than opening his mind to new possibilities. I really needed to get to purifying his Xianyi. "Li Chong," I said carefully, "what you witnessed wasn't about destiny or chosen status. It was about examining beliefs honestly and accepting what the evidence actually shows." The old servant's face scrunched up in confusion. "But young master, surely your ability to reveal the truth to others is proof of your superiority? Who but one marked by heaven itself could show a world-rich sovereign the error of his ways?" Before I could figure out how to respond to that without crushing his spirits, the city lord himself spoke up. "The young man is correct," Feng Xiaoyang said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that was completely different from his earlier bombast. "What happened here wasn't about destiny or divine mandate. It was about the difference between thinking clearly and, well, what I was doing before." He brushed dirt from his robes and looked around the clearing with new eyes. "For 3 centuries, I've ruled this city based on the assumption that my power proved my righteousness. That success validated my beliefs. But power and success can come from many sources: inheritance, fear, habit, or simply being the only option available." Little Bloom had released my legs and was now staring up at the city lord with obvious curiosity. "Why were you so angry before?" she asked with the direct honesty that only children could manage. "You were all sparkly and loud and scary." Feng Xiaoyang knelt down to her level, his expression softening. "Because I was afraid, little one. Afraid that if I stopped believing I was special, I would become worthless. But I was wrong about that too." "Oh," she said, considering this seriously. "Papa says being afraid makes some people mean. But you're not mean now." "No," he agreed, glancing up at the ancient oak. "I'm not." The oak's massive form shifted slightly, his attention focusing on the city lord. "The transformation is remarkable to observe," he rumbled. "Where once your presence felt like standing too close to a fire that insisted it was the sun, now you simply feel like a person." "That's probably the most accurate description of Xianyi corruption I've heard yet," I said, impressed despite myself. The insistence on cosmic importance without the actual authority to back it up. The Stone Emperor, not to be outdone in offering observations, chimed in with his own analysis. "Indeed, this humble stone has witnessed many who claimed greatness, but few who actually possessed it. The difference is now clear. True strength requires no constant proclamation." I had to smile at that. Even as a disbeliever's energy affected him, the Stone Emperor was still managing to be pompous. Some personality traits apparently ran deeper than cultivation systems. Feng Xiaoyang stood and turned to face me directly. "Du Yanzi," he said formally, "I owe you an apology and a debt. You've shown me truths I've spent centuries avoiding. If you're truly committed to helping others see past their delusions, then you have my support." I nodded, accepting his words with what I hoped was appropriate gravity. But internally, I was thinking about how this wasn't really my mission at all. I'd come to this realm for a tournament battle against Yuanjin. Everything else had been experimentation and accident. I'd awakened these beings because I was curious about consciousness creation. I challenged the city lord's beliefs because I was buying time and testing theories about energy interactions. But looking around at the small community of awakened beings that had formed around me, I felt something I hadn't expected: responsibility. Little Bloom was still staring at Feng Xiaoyang with fascination, occasionally asking questions about why grown-ups made things so complicated. The ancient oak was explaining local politics to some of the newly awakened bushes, his centuries of observation providing context they desperately needed. Even the Stone Emperor was holding court with a few awakened pebbles, regaling them with stories of his grand plans for geological civilization. These beings were real people now, with their own thoughts and desires and fears. They hadn't asked to be awakened, but now that they deserved a chance to exist in a world that wouldn't immediately try to destroy them for thinking clearly. And this realm, it was sick. The Blue Sun corruption had turned what should have been a healthy cultivation environment into a madhouse where every rock and tree was convinced they were the center of the universe. The few beings who managed to see through the delusion were labeled as dangerous heretics and eliminated. In the cultivation novels I'd read, this was exactly the kind of situation where the protagonist would step in to fix things. And while I wasn't exactly a traditional protagonist, I was probably the closest thing this realm had to someone who could actually address the underlying problems. "Master," Azure said quietly, "I can practically hear you talking yourself into taking on another massive responsibility." He wasn't wrong. But what was the alternative? Take advantage of this world's resources and people in my preparation for my battle with Yuanzhen? Then leave this realm to continue its slow descent into complete madness? That was unbelievably selfish and went against my own values. "I'll do whatever is in my power to help," I thought back to him. "Besides, even if I don't succeed personally, Du Yanzi might. And he's definitely got protagonist potential." The classic "it's the right thing to do and might be profitable" justification, Azure observed with dry amusement. "I can't argue with the logic, though I do question your ability to maintain a low profile while revolutionizing an entire realm's spiritual framework." That was a valid concern. There was no way to hide what Feng Xiaoyang had become. That disbeliever aura was like a beacon announcing his change to anyone with decent spiritual senses. The charade was essentially over. Within hours, every cultivator in the region would know that their city lord had fallen to a crisis of doubt. They'd want to know what could possibly have caused such a dramatic transformation in a world-rich sovereign. And when they investigated, they'd find Du Yanzi, a failed young master who'd somehow gained the power to convert authority figures. Even if the locals suspected that Du Yanzi was merely a disbeliever himself and not possessed, Yuanzhen definitely would put the pieces together and figure out that the young master had been chosen as my vessel. "You know what?" I said to Azure, making up my mind. "It's time to stop pretending I'm just Du Yanzi with a lucky breakthrough." I glanced around at my small gathering of followers. They'd already seen me do things that no normal crowned heart realm cultivator should be capable of. The ancient oak had witnessed me casually rewrite consciousness itself. The stone emperor had felt energies that transcended anything in their local cultivation system. And now I had a former world-rich sovereign whose spiritual signature would scream disbeliever to anyone with decent cultivation. There was no hiding what had happened here, which meant there was no point in trying to stay subtle about what came next. Maybe it was time to stop playing it safe. Maybe it was time to acquire some more resources. Maybe it was time to take over a city. Little Bloom had been listening to the grown-ups talk with the patient expression of a child who understood that important things were being discussed, even if the details went over her head. But now she wandered back over to me, her tiny branches swaying as she walked across the uneven ground with the careful steps of someone still getting used to having legs. She looked up at me with bright, curious eyes. "Are we going to help more people think better thoughts?" "Yes," I said, patting her leaves again. "We're going to help a lot more people." Suddenly, a brilliant flash of light drew everyone's attention skyward. High above the forest canopy, glowing characters began forming in the air. A simple golden number. 3. Feng Xiaoyang's eyes widened as he stared at the glowing numeral. "Impossible," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "The divine beings, they must have descended in secret. Their battle is fast approaching." I couldn't help but smile at his words. After all, before the dramatic announcement, I was just about to reveal that I was one of those so-called divine beings he was talking about. "What does the number mean?" Little Bloom asked, tugging on my robe. "It means we have 3 days to help people," I murmured. "Interesting. I thought I still had 5 or 6 days left before my confrontation with Yuanzhen. But it seemed either the sect elders were eager to accelerate the tournament schedule, or more likely, the passage of time was faster in this realm than the realm of living lyrics. Regardless of the reason, it meant I had even less time than expected to acquire some powerful techniques from the city for my clash with Yuanzhen. Captain Ji Haozhe shifted uncomfortably on his horse, his hands gripping the reins as he stared at the tree line ahead. The forest loomed before them like a wall of shadow. Behind him, 8 of the city's finest guards sat in their saddles with varying degrees of patience, their spiritual pressure carefully controlled to avoid interfering with whatever was happening deeper in the woods. "Sir," Wei Ming said quietly, his voice carrying the particular note of someone trying very hard not to sound nervous. "How long do you think the city lord will need to apprehend one disbeliever?" Ji Haozhe didn't answer immediately. In 300 years, he'd only encountered 3 disbelievers, and each experience had left him feeling like he'd brushed against something fundamentally wrong with the world. The memory of their empty spiritual pressure, the way reality seemed to flinch away from their presence, still gave him nightmares. "Patience, Wei Ming," he said finally. "Lord Feng is a world-rich sovereign. Even if Du Yanze has fully transitioned, he's still just a former crowned heart realm cultivator. The power difference is insurmountable." "If I may ask, Captain," said Guard Lucien, a younger man who joined their unit only 2 years ago, "what exactly makes disbelievers so dangerous? I mean, if they've lost their faith in their own chosenness, wouldn't that make them weaker?" Several of the older guards exchanged glances. Ji Haozhe sighed, recognizing the question for what it was, genuine curiosity from someone who'd never faced the existential horror of confronting a being who could simply deny the validity of your techniques. "Tell me, Lucien," Ji Haozhe said, turning in his saddle to face the younger man. "What do you know about the great doubt plague a millennia ago?" Lucien's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. "I remember some mentions in the academy texts. Something about a period of spiritual instability." "Spiritual instability," Wei Ming snorted. "That's like calling a wildfire thermal irregularities. The Great Doubt Plague nearly destroyed the entire western province." Ji Haozhe nodded grimly. 1,000 years ago, disbelievers weren't the rare aberrations we see today. They were everywhere. Entire cities fell when their spiritual foundations collapsed, when enough people stopped believing in the basic principles that held their cultivation systems together. He paused, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. The air was too still, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. "It started in Jade River City," he continued. "A merchant cultivator named Huang Yaoshi suffered a crisis of doubt after losing his family and fortune in a business deal gone wrong. But instead of simply falling into despair, he began actively preaching that chosenness itself was a lie, that all cultivation was just elaborate self-deception. And people listened to him?" Lucien asked, clearly struggling to understand how such obviously heretical ideas could take root. "People who were already suffering, yes," said Guard Chen Lao, an older man with gray streaks in his hair. "Those who'd lost loved ones, failed breakthrough attempts, been humiliated by their superiors. The merchant's words offered them something that their shattered faith couldn't, a reason for their failures that didn't require them to blame themselves." Ji Haozhe watched the younger guards process this information. This was an era where disbelievers were rare boogeyman stories, not a genuine existential threat to civilization itself. "The plague spread like wildfire," Wei Ming added. "City after city fell as their spiritual foundations crumbled. Cultivation techniques stopped working when too many people stopped believing in them. Formation arrays collapsed when their operators lost faith in their effectiveness. Even spirit beasts began losing their natural abilities when the ambient Xianyi became too corrupted with doubt." "How was it stopped?" asked Guard Zhangfeng, a middle-aged man who usually preferred action to conversation. "The purification orders," Ji Haozhe replied, his voice taking on the reverent tone reserved for discussing heroes of legend. "Specialized organizations trained specifically to identify, contain, and if necessary, eliminate disbelievers before their corruption could spread. The Order of Absolute Faith, the Sword Saints of Unwavering Conviction, the Celestial Tribunal of Divine Certainty." He gestured toward the forest. The methods they developed, the techniques for spiritual reconditioning, the containment protocols, all of it came from that dark period. By the time the plague was contained, entire regions had been reduced to spiritual wastelands where cultivation was impossible for generations. But that was 1,000 years ago, Lucien protested. Surely we've learned enough to prevent something like that from happening again. Have we? Ji Haoju's voice was quiet, thoughtful. When was the last time any of you actually encountered a disbeliever? When was the last time you had to use the containment techniques we drill with every month? The silence that followed was telling. Most of the guards had never faced a real disbeliever in combat. The techniques they practiced were theoretical, learned from manuals and demonstrated against willing volunteers who were still full of faith in their own abilities. The problem, Chun Lao said slowly, is that in becoming rare, disbelievers have also become less understood. 1,000 years ago, we knew exactly how they operated, what to expect from them. Now, a distant rumble echoed through the air, causing all the horses to shift nervously. Ji Haoju felt his own spiritual pressure fluctuate in response to whatever was happening deeper in the forest. The sensation was familiar, the aftershock of powerful techniques clashing against each other. At least Lord Feng seems to have engaged the target, Wei Ming observed. That's got to be his world-writ sovereign spiritual pressure we're feeling. Ji Haoju nodded, but something felt wrong. The energy patterns were too chaotic, too unstable. World-writ sovereigns were known for their precise control, their ability to impose their will on reality with surgical precision. What he was sensing felt more like, "Sir," Zhang Feng called out sharply. Movement in the tree line. Every guard immediately straightened in their saddles, hands moving to weapons as they watched figures emerge from the forest. Ji Haoju squinted against the late afternoon light, trying to make out the details of the approaching group. City Lord Feng Zhaoyang walked at the front, his ceremonial robes dirt-stained and his usually perfect hair disheveled. Behind him came the elderly servant Li Chong, followed by Du Yanzi himself. But what caused Ji Haoju's blood to run cold wasn't the presence of the supposed disbeliever. It was what followed them. An enormous oak tree was walking through the forest, its massive roots pulling free from the earth with each ponderous step. Smaller plants and even what appeared to be a boulder were moving alongside the group, creating a procession that looked like something out of a fever dream. If you come across this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. What in the 9 heavens? Wei Ming breathed. Sir, Lucien said excitedly. It looks like Lord Feng successfully apprehended the disbeliever, and he's managed to animate the forest itself as additional security. Truly, the power of a world-writ sovereign is... Ji Haoju's hand shot out, gripping the younger guard's wrist with enough force to cut off circulation. Stop talking, he hissed. Something is very, very wrong here. As the group drew closer, Ji Haoju's worst fears were confirmed. The spiritual pressure emanating from City Lord Feng was completely different from what it had been an hour ago. Gone was the golden certainty of a world-writ sovereign, replaced by something dark and corrosive that made Ji Haoju's teeth ache just being in its presence. Disbeliever aura. Their own city lord had fallen to a crisis of doubt. Captain, Wei Ming's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. That can't be. Everyone stay calm, Ji Haoju said quietly, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. Form up. Combat Formation X. Do not engage until I give the signal. The guards' horses wheeled into position as they prepared for what might be the most important battle of their lives. Behind them, Ji Haoju could hear Lucien muttering prayers under his breath. Lord Feng, Ji Haoju called out as the group approached within speaking distance. We were instructed to wait for your return with the prisoner. The man who had been their city lord for years looked up with eyes that held none of their familiar authority. Instead, there was a strange peace in his expression, as if he'd just woken from a long and troubled sleep. Captain Ji Haoju, Feng Zhaoyang said, there is no prisoner. There never was. My lord, Wei Ming said carefully, we can sense the spiritual corruption emanating from you. Please allow us to escort you back to the city for purification. The tribunal can. The tribunal operates on the same fundamental delusions that I've spent my entire life embracing. Feng Zhaoyang interrupted. Tell me, Captain, in your years of service, how many times have you seen those purification techniques actually work? How many disbelievers have you watched willingly return to a life of self-deception? Ji Haozhe felt sweat beading on his forehead. This was exactly the kind of insidious corruption the training manuals warned about. The way disbelievers could make their twisted philosophy sound reasonable, even appealing. Du Yanzi, he called out, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. You are under arrest for spiritual corruption and inciting a crisis of doubt in a city official. Surrender now and we may be able to arrange for reconditioning rather than execution. Du Yanzi looked at him with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. Captain, would it help if I told you that Lord Feng came to the forest intending to arrest me, and left understanding that his entire worldview was built on contradictions he could no longer ignore? The Divine Master speaks only truth, the massive tree added. This humble servant witnessed the moment when the false ruler's delusions crumbled before perfect clarity. Divine Master? Chun Lao repeated, confusion evident in his voice. Du Yanzi raised his hand, and to Ji Haozhe's absolute horror, spiritual energy began gathering around his palm. But this wasn't the chaotic, reality-denying force of a typical disbeliever. The energy moved with purpose, with control, forming complex patterns that spoke of advanced cultivation. I asked Lord Feng the same question that I'll ask you, Du Yanzi said, his voice carrying a strange authority. If belief in personal chosenness is truly the foundation of strength, then why do most people who believe themselves chosen fail to accomplish anything significant? Why do the techniques that rely on conviction alone fail when confronted with practical knowledge and skill? Because their belief isn't pure enough. Lu Xian burst out, desperation making his voice crack. Because they haven't fully embraced their destined. So, failure is always the result of insufficient faith? Du Yanzi asked gently. Never the result of attempting something that simply cannot be done? Ji Haozhe felt his own certainty beginning to waver and immediately began the breathing exercises designed to reinforce spiritual stability. Around him, his guards were doing the same, their faces tight with concentration as they fought against the insidious pull of doubt. Silence! Wei Ming shouted, channeling his Xian Yi into a technique he'd practiced 10,000 times. Blazing palm strike. Golden fire erupted from his outstretched palm, racing toward Du Yanzi with the speed of pure faith made manifest. It was a perfect execution of a crowned heart realm technique, backed by years of unwavering belief in its effectiveness. Du Yanzi didn't move. The fire struck something invisible a foot from his body and simply stopped existing. Not blocked, not deflected, not absorbed. The technique ceased to be real, as if the universe itself had decided it had never been anything more than wishful thinking. Wei Ming staggered in his saddle, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as the spiritual backlash tore through his meridians. Attack! Ji Haozhe roared, knowing that hesitation now meant death for all of them. 7 guards unleashed their most powerful techniques simultaneously. Lightning carved through the air, stone constructs erupted from the earth, wind blades sharp enough to cut steel screamed toward their targets. It was a coordinated assault that could have leveled a building, backed by the combined faith of 8 devoted city guards. Feng Zhaoyang raised his hand. The world went silent. Every technique, every manifestation of spiritual energy, every expression of Xian Yibact will simply stopped. The lightning froze in midair. The stone constructs crumbled back into ordinary dirt. The wind blades dissolved into gentle breezes. Then the spiritual pressure hit them. It wasn't the golden authority of a world-rich sovereign asserting his dominance. This was something far more terrifying. The weight of absolute certainty pressing down on their minds like a physical force. Not certainty in personal greatness or divine chosenness, but certainty in the fundamental nature of reality itself. One by one, the guards were driven to their knees as their horses collapsed beneath them. Ji Haozhe felt his own spiritual foundation cracking under the pressure, decades of carefully maintained beliefs splintering like glass. You've spent your lives, Feng Zhaoyang said quietly, his voice somehow audible despite the crushing weight of his aura, serving a system built on a single, fundamental lie, the lie that personal conviction can override natural law. That believing in your own importance strongly enough makes you actually important. Ji Haozhe tried to speak, to argue, to maintain the faith that had sustained him throughout his years of service. But the words wouldn't come. Under the relentless pressure of the former city lord's certainty, all his carefully constructed beliefs were crumbling. "Look around you," Feng Xiaoyang continued, gesturing to the awakened plants and the content stone that had somehow acquired consciousness. "These beings have found purpose without needing to believe they're the center of the universe. They contribute, they grow, they help others, not because they think they're specially chosen, but because cooperation and mutual support are how healthy communities actually function." The massive oak swayed gently, its voice filled with something that might have been compassion. This one spent 800 years believing it was destined to rule an empire of stone and wood. Such arrogance, such waste. Only when the great liberator showed me the truth could I find actual peace. "Great liberator?" Chen Lao gasped, the words torn from his throat by the crushing weight of revelation. Du Yanzi stepped forward, and Ji Haozhe saw not the calculated compassion of someone seeking to build followers, but the simple desire to help others understand something that had brought him peace. "I'm not trying to destroy your faith," Du Yanzi said gently. "I'm trying to show you the difference between faith based on evidence and experience, and faith based on wishful thinking. You can believe in your abilities because you've trained them. You can have confidence in your techniques because you understand how they work. You can trust in your worth as people because of the good you do for others." He paused, his gaze taking in each of the kneeling guards. "But believing the universe revolves around your personal destiny, that your wants and needs matter more than everyone else's, that's not faith. That's delusion. And delusions make you weaker, not stronger." The spiritual pressure began to ease, but instead of relief, Ji Haozhe felt something far more disturbing. The manic certainty that had driven him was gone, replaced by clarity. For the first time in his life, his thoughts felt clear and uncluttered. "We've been..." Wei Ming struggled to form words, his voice hoarse from spiritual strain. "Everything we believed. It was all." "Not all of it," Feng Xiaoyang said, kneeling down to bring himself to eye level with his former subordinates. "You believed in protecting the innocent. You believed in serving your community. You believed in standing up to danger even when you were afraid. Those beliefs were real, and they were worth something." Ji Haozhe looked up into the eyes of the man he'd served faithfully, and saw none of the authority or arrogance he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he saw someone who looked genuinely sorry for what they'd all been through. "The corruption you feel from us," Du Yanzi added, "isn't really corruption at all. It's just the absence of delusion. Your spiritual senses have been trained to recognize self-aggrandizing energy as pure and rational thinking as corrupted. But now that you can think clearly, how does it actually feel?" Ji Haozhe paused, taking inventory of his internal state. The disbeliever aura that had felt so nauseating and wrong an hour ago now seemed peaceful, like coming inside from a storm or setting down a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. Around him, his guards were coming to the same realization. The madness was gone. The desperate need to prove their worth, to maintain their importance, to cling to beliefs that had never quite made sense. All of it had simply evaporated. For the first time in their lives, they could think clearly, and it felt wonderful,